Welcome everyone to my second video for Chapter 4. In this video, I want to go over the audit risk model. So the audit risk model is shown for you right here, and we could abbreviate this to say AR equals IR times CR times DR. So what exactly does that mean? So we start with AR, or audit risk. So audit risk, as you may recall, is the probability that we make an incorrect opinion, that we issue the wrong opinion, we don't find a misstatement when there really is one. So the first step in this process is to set that audit risk to an acceptable level, and typically that's going to be an acceptably low level. So we might be willing to take a 2% risk that we issue that wrong opinion and miss a misstatement, or a 5% risk that we issue the wrong opinion because we've missed a misstatement. So we start there, is how much risk are we willing to take? Then the next step is we have to assess our risk of material misstatement. Now, risk of material misstatement is simply our inherent risk, or IR, times our control risk, or CR. So those two things together is called the risk of material misstatement. And what that means is within our client, within the client that we are auditing, how much risk do we see? How much risk is there in their environment and in their industry and in everything that they have going on? How have they dealt with that risk relating to their controls? So how much risk, how risky is this particular client? So that's our risk of material misstatement. So we have to start with a risk assessment in this piece to determine how much risk we have there. So then we can move on to step 3, which is where we will calculate our detection risk. So detection risk is what the auditor responds to, how the auditor responds to that risk of material misstatement. So remember, risk of material misstatement, IRCR, that's what's happening in the client's environment, and detection risk is how the auditor will respond to what is going on within that client environment. So the overarching goal is that we are assessing risk at an adequate level. So that is this idea of our audit risk model. So I want to move forward and just take a look at how these things interact again. So here we have our IR and our CR. These two things, again, taken together, are that risk of material misstatement. And what we have here is, depending on how we've assessed these risks, high, low, or medium, will dictate our response in that DR piece. So in the middle here is the DR. How high or low does DR need to be given what we're seeing within that client? So for example, if our inherent risk was low and our control risk was low, meaning we have a low risk client, that means our DR, or our detection risk, can be high. So a low risk client, low risk of material misstatement, tells us that this client doesn't have a lot of risk of material misstatement, so we can increase or have a high level of detection risk. Remember, detection risk is the risk that we might miss something. So if we have a high level of detection risk, that means we're willing to take on a higher level of risk that we might miss something. And we're willing to take on that higher level of risk because we know that the client is steady and secure and there's a low risk at the client level. So if the client has a low level of risk, we're willing to take on a higher level of risk. That means that we have an inverse relationship between the risk of material misstatement and what's happening within the client and how the auditor will respond to that level of risk. So what comes next? So we have something called our net of testing. Net stands for nature, extent, and timing. So depending on where we have determined that DR, or that detection risk, is going to be, how much risk we are willing to take, how much work we need to do based on what's going on within the client, that's going to help drive the nature, extent, and timing of the audit test that we put together when we're doing our audit plan. So what do I mean by these nature, extent, and timing? So nature deals with the type of test that we're going to do, and we have a couple of different options. First, we have a test of details, and second, we have a substantive analytical procedure. So a test of details is more efficient but less effective. So it's more efficient because we're going to really dive in, go look at the details, pull the invoices, and look at exactly what's happening within those particular accounts or transactions. A substantive analytical procedure, on the other hand, is going to be less effective but more efficient. Substantive analytical procedures, just like any other analytical procedure, is looking at trends in the data. So we're going to look at some particular trends, look at things, how they compare to one another, but not look at the actual details about what's going on. So we'll be able to very quickly determine if we think there might be a problem, but we won't be able to find what that exact problem is. So those are our two types of tests that we can use, which is the nature of the tests that we might use. The extent is how many tests we need to do. So how many different procedures, how many different items on our checklist of our audit plan do we need to do? How big does our sample size need to be? So extent is going to grow with more risk. So as we have a higher risk of material misstatement, our extent is also going to grow. We're going to want to do more tests to try and find more errors. We're going to want to have bigger sample sizes to find more errors. So that's the E there for extent. And then finally, the T in our net of testing deals with timing. So we can either do our tests at the interim period, which is before year end, or we can wait until year end to do those tests. So as we are having a greater degree of risk of material misstatement, we're going to want to shift those tests more toward the interim. So I have my last slide here in this video is how we will deal with that net of testing. So how big does our net need to be based on our detection risk? So if we need lower detection risk, again, lower detection risk is going to come because we have higher risk of material misstatement. So in those cases where we have more risky clients, we need to do a better job in our audit. So that means we're going to want to do more effective tests. Again, that's relying more on those tests of details. We're going to want to do more tests. We're going to have more lines on our audit program. We're going to have bigger sample sizes, and we're going to want to move that timing to year end. Whereas if we have higher detection risk because we have lower risk of material misstatement, the client is less risky, so we are able to do a more cursory audit program. We're going to have less effective tests. We can rely more heavily on those substantive analytical procedures. We can have smaller sample sizes. We can have smaller lines on our checklist, fewer tests that we have to actually perform. And we can also do those tests at the interim. So that concludes my audit risk model video. I'll look forward to seeing you in the next one.